I'm Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology, and today I'm going to talk about using incense in astrological magic. So what set this off was I had someone asking me this week, and I actually get a lot of inquiries from people that are very worried about what's the incense you should use for this particular thing, and what's the one you should use for that. They really they were kind of stressed out about you've got to get a specific incense. And I realize this is sort of join the you have to do X, Y, and Z, along with like wearing the talisman 24 hours a day, which I don't know where that comes from. People are always asking me, do I have to wear it in the shower? I'm like, no. And this idea that you got to wear it next to your skin or it doesn't work at all. Again, it's sort of become one of those things that you have to have this specific kind of incense. And kind of underlying this is, people are really worried about the whole process, or at least they don't want to make a mistake. And I guess that's from the idea that this is, you'll ruin it or blow your head off or it's dangerous. But there's a right way to do things, and you need to figure out what the right way to do that things are and do it that way. So again, in this video, I'm going to be talking about my approach, which is called the devotional approach. And I think it's very informed by sort of Catholic practice. And so, again, there you really don't worry about specific incense for each saint. I mean, I suppose you could go to their shrine and they might have a candle you could get for that saint. That's cool. Or they might even have incense for it, but you wouldn't have to do that. And the other thing would be that, if you made a mistake, venerating a saint or angel, you wouldn't be thinking, oh, I did an extra Hail Mary and now I'm cursed for life. I mean, that would be a kind of an odd approach to it. Really what we're dealing with here are these angels. We're interfacing with the celestials on an angelic level. We're dealing with very powerful but benign beings. And for me, the watchword is to be respectful. Don't be a fool, don't be a child, but you don't also need to be fearful about the process. There's lots of ways to do ritual. I mean, my way is not the only way. Lots of ways you could approach this. My focus is going to be on expressing respect, and then showing your friendship and developing that friendship and the relationship with the celestial angels. And then also it's really a great way to express your creativity. Clients will send me these pictures of their wonderful altars, that really are very individualistic but very beautiful, and at the same time very much in the spirit of the angel, on the planet or fixed star or whatever that they're trying to, get in touch with. I think it's really wonderful to see that use of it. And you really, I think, want to have a ritual that you find inspiring, that kind of elevates you, and that, again, like I said, expresses your respect. So let's just talk a little bit about incense. It's interesting. One of the problems with this idea that you have to have specific incense, a lot of things I'm going to be talking about are practical. You can argue about stuff on social media, but when it comes down to actually doing it, you kind of have to get practical. Particularly if you're doing regular stuff, you're doing it, not once a year, but you're trying to do this every day or, more frequently. So one of the things about the specific incense that's a problem is that, people get so worried about it that if they can't get specific incense, they might just give up the invocation entirely, or they'll just drop using incense. To me, it's better to use some kind of incense, reasonably appropriate, rather than giving up because you don't have a specific kind. I mean, the incense and fumigation are so key in our traditional sources. They're so important. And to me, it's so much better to use some kind of incense rather than none at all. And in terms of specific incense, I mean, it just may not be obtainable. I mean, you may not have any way of getting specific stuff. It may not even be available to anybody. Again, you might be dealing with something like, for example, lignum aloes. This is it's endangered, and you don't really want to use that as incense. You could also be dealing with stuff, even though it's in the traditional source, it doesn't mean it's safe. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there that you really don't want to burn, or even handle some of the stuff. So there's a lot of practical reasons why you wouldn't want to necessarily use the specific incense that's listed in that source. So what I do is I use Japanese temple stick incense for everything that I do. I very rarely, I have a bunch of resin incense sort of stored up if I wanted to do it. I went on this sort of collecting spree at one point, but really what I use is, like I said, it's Japanese temple stick incense, and this is what the box looks like. This is used in my the head temple Aheiji of my Soto Zen lineage. Let me just open it up here and show you what it looks like. This is just, like I said, just standard old stick incense. The other thing that I do is, again, rather than having like specific colors or worrying about what color is for that, I use white votive candles for everything. I'm doing so much ritual. I'm constantly doing ritual that I use, white votive candles. And you can see behind me, look at the altar space, lots of mirrors, lots of white, light, clear glass, things like that. That's kind of the focus, bright light. That's kind of the motif that goes along with all my stuff. So I think that, again, white is a good neutral color. So that's what I use. And I mean, I buy these white candles by the case. I mean, I'll buy a case, it'll have boxes of, I think they're like, um, you know, 70 in a box or something in a case of five. I mean, hundreds of these candles because I'm constantly using them. And so I cannot, if I had to juggle all the stuff I was doing and do specific colors, it's just not practical. But nevertheless, I can show my respect, use candles, and use them in the white votive candles. And what I'm typically doing is I've got sort of again, you can see behind me some of my altars, the sort of station set up, and I move the candles from station to station as I'm doing the invocation. Moving through the whole. I have a ritual that I do every day, for example, and I move through the different stations of my altars to do that ritual. And again, you don't have to do it that way, but like I said, it's an example of one way of going about things rather than like the Solomonic stuff. I mean, they have a setup in there. Great, use that if you want to, but it's not the only way of doing it. Now, what I would say about specific incense is that you don't have to use it, but if you want to, that's nice. I mean, what I would say is that it's a bit like having a friend who loves a particular kind of cake and they come over to visit your house and you've got the specific kind of cake. I mean, that would be very gracious and, very respectful to have that cake. And that's, again, for the, angel of a particular talisman. If you've got the specific incense that's appropriate for them, that's very respectful. You're kind of going that extra mile. But again, if your friend comes over and you don't have that cake, they're not going to freak out on you. If they were, they're not much of a friend. And if you don't have that cake and you give them nothing and they go hungry, that's not cool either. It's like whatever you have to eat, offer it to them, And that's, again, what I would say about the incense. So again, great if you want to make the extra effort, but also, if you can't, it's not obtainable or it's too much effort or whatever to do special incense every day, at least do some kind of incense. And that's why the stick incense is very helpful, very practical. So let's just talk about, where are we getting this specific incense if we're going to use it? Where are we getting that from? Now, our traditional sources often will list a specific incense. Picatrix, Book 4, Chapter 9, the 28 Mansions of the Moon. Each of those mansions, it lists a specific incense for that particular type of mansion. Not generalized for every use of that mansion because there's other sources, but just for the Picatrix Book 4, Chapter 9 mansions. Okay, I really am not a big mixer matcher with this stuff of moving it around. People like to do that. Like, I'll do the Book 1, Chapter 9 for, destruction, and I'll use the Book 1, Book 4, Chapter 9, same mansion for love. I'll use the incense for that. I don't think they're interchangeable. But that's a whole nother video. But anyhow, so let's get some examples from Picatrix Book 4, Chapter 9 of specific incense. So it says the third mansion, with the acquisition of all good things. When the moon is passed in this mansion, you make the talisman and then sense it or suffumigate it, move it through the smoke of the incense with musk, camphor, mastic, and aromatic oils. So again, that's all doable stuff. There's even some mastic. This is gum mastic. It's a resin. It looks a lot like frankincense. It's a resin incense. Got some of that. Now, what I could see people doing is saying, well, I don't have all four of those things. It's like, again, don't freak out. I mean, if you just get mastic, that's fine. And again, you don't even have to use those four things at all. So going ahead and getting mastic, and camphor, for example, those work as incenses, that's fine. So let me give you another example. Eighth mansion says for the acquisition of victory, when the moon is traveling this mansion, you make the talisman, and then you sense it with sulfur. Okay, now, this is another example. Now, burning sulfur is really hazardous, okay? It's not a good thing to do. It stinks, okay? And it also produces sulfur dioxide. And sulfur dioxide, when it combines with water, like, for example, in your eyes, like tears, produces sulfuric acid. So definitely not something you're going to want to be doing inside under any circumstances, and even outside is pretty dangerous. So, I mean, why do you want to do that? It's not necessary. It's like, well, the book says so. I mean, this is, be smart, folks, okay? Be practical, safety first. Don't mess yourself up just because the book says to do that, okay? So, again, those are like I said, that's an example of specific sources. Now, when you get to planets, as far as specific incense, there's a huge amount of variation. If anyone says, well, you have to use this for, Jupiter, they don't know what they're talking about because there's like probably 50 different things you could use as incense for Jupiter, depending on which source you're looking at. I mean, the classic stuff, like for example, Saturn stinks, anything really smelly and fetid or whatever. It's like, which doesn't really excite me in terms of, wanting to do a Saturn invocation and burning something all smelly. It doesn't sound good. What I use is pine. Pine is ruled by Saturn, perfectly appropriate, and it's nice smelling. So a good example of practical stuff. Now, something that's kind of done without even really thinking about it, but I think it's logical, but I think people have just automatically jumped to doing it. It's part of the whole modern mix and match stuff, is that if there's plants and herbs ruled by the planet or fixed star, then people use those as incense. And that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, it seems like that would be appropriate. It doesn't say that in the source, but it's something I think would make sense. So the Quadripartitus variant of Hermes on the 15 fixed stars, if you look at that, it says Algol rules black hellebore and mugwort. Now, normally in what they're saying in that source is use them as part of the talisman. So they have this methodology where you have a gemstone ruled by the fixed star, and you put that gemstone together with herbs and plants ruled by the fixed star to make a talisman at the elected time and do the invocation. So they're not using it as incense, but that's not illogical. It makes sense to me. Again, the problem here though, black hellebore, that's poisonous, okay? Also not something that's easily obtainable. So you do not want to use black hellebore or hellebore for algal incense, but mugwort, that's good. I mean, that's an herb that's easily available. You can get it, and then you can burn it as incense if you're going to do algal. And that's what I would typically recommend if someone says, what incense should you use for algal? I'd say, well, if you want to use a specific incense, you'd use mugwort. But what's interesting about it is that in this traditional source, Quadripartitus, their approach in terms of incense is not to use the ones that are ruled by a specific planet or give specific incense for each fixed star, but there's a scholium, which is kind of like a addendum or kind of notes attributed to Mashallah, who's a very famous Arabic astrologer. And what he does is has two different lists, and they're all just different kinds of incense. They're general list. One list is for benefic purposes, and one list is for malefic purposes. And they tend to be sort of sweet smelling for benefic or nasty smelling for the malefic, which kind of makes sense. So if you want to do something good and you're doing a fixed star with it, you'd use a benefic incense regardless of what the fixed star was. And one of the things I think was really kind of cool about this was that Mashallah lists frankincense as a benefic incense, and that's what I've been recommending to people. Is people said, what should I use as a general incense? And I would say for positive purposes, for benefic purposes, use frankincense. So it's cool to see my intuition from being 30 years of being steeped in this tradition, kind of shown up by the traditional source, which had was thinking along the same lines. So let's do some practical incense tips. And again, we're dealing with fire here, folks. So always safety first. Okay, you always need to be thinking about fire safety. That needs to be your primary consideration. Not magical stuff. Not what people say in the book. Not what people say on social media. Not hoping that you're going to get some kind of magical bang out of it, but fire safety, okay? And the key with that is never having unattended flame, whether it's a candle or incense. Like I said, with incense charcoal, if you're using that, we'll talk about it a little bit, or stick incense, that's hot, that's going to burn, and you don't want to leave it unattended any more than when you leave a candle unattended. And I don't care what anybody says about having candles burn down all the way. Do not do that unless you're actually in the room 100% of the time. Okay, if you're walking out for somewhere for 45 minutes or whatever, just unless you're actually in the room watching those candles, put them out. Okay? Now, again, what I do, like I said, is the votive candles. And what I like about the votive candles is that they're not going to fall over. The wax isn't going to suddenly melt all over the place. You're not going to have an uncontrolled burn for some reason. They're going to stay right in that votive candle and burn down. And it's very efficient, too, because the wax tends to burn up. They'll tend to channel. You have to kind of mess with them a little bit, but they pretty much will burn up all the wax as they go down, so it's very efficient. And the votive holders are good. They will crack from time to time. I mean, if you have heat, particularly if you have too big of what I try to do is keep those the wicks really trimmed really small, so we don't have a very big flame coming out of it. You don't want to have a flame that's flicking up against the sides, but they will crack from time to time. So what I do in addition to that is I have this tempered glass, kind of candle holder thing that they're sitting on top of like this. Okay, so not only is the candle in the votive holder, but it's sitting on top of that tempered glass candle holder. And then you can see how I've got the incense. I use a very small amount of incense. You can see that, and just this holder here is sitting in there. You can, light it before I stick it in, and then you can sort of suffumigate it over that. And so let me just show you this holder. This is just ceramic. This comes with, typical, not with the Japanese incense, but, typical stick incense that you buy. I'll have these little incense burner holder in it. So that's the setup that I use for it. And again, that the incense is sitting there on top of the glass, and it's not sitting on top of wooden or something that could burn or something like that. You could put it on a plate. That would work well too. So that's the typical setup that I use. If you're going to use resin incense, and again, I was showing the mastic. I mean, frankincense often comes in this sort of like little tiers. Then what you're going to have is an incense burner. Okay, and again, this is brass. And then inside of it, I use a little bit of foil here. You can see on the bottom for a flat surface, and then there's the charcoal. If you're going to use resin incense, you have to use incense charcoal. And then the key with all that stuff is you got to have tongs. Okay, do not be picking up the charcoal that's burning, or you want to burn with your fingers. Don't pick up the resin incense with your fingers. Always use tongs. Okay, so what you do is you take the incense out of the burner here, and then say my finger's like a flame. You just put it up the edge there, do the edge, get the edge going, and I'll probably have to blow on it and keep it going. It's actually a lot of work to get these things going and get it set up properly. This is why I use the stick incense. So one of the things I would say about the charcoal is the stuff you get online, the cheap stuff is this round charcoal, often made in India or whatever. Don't get that stuff. I mean, it's not good charcoal. It tends to splutter like crazy. And it's funny, I have a story about that. I had this guy emails me, he bought a talisman, and he was really freaked out. He's like, I think it's a bad omen. I'm going to throw the talisman away. And I said, what happened? He said, well, when I lit the incense charcoal, it started popping and spluttering. And I'm like, yeah, that's what that cheap round incense charcoal does, is it pops and splutters all over the place, send sparks out. What you want to get is the Japanese charcoal. Incense charcoal. And that's like this stuff. I have a link to there, along with a link to where I get that Japanese stick incense, and it comes in like I said, a rectangle or a square like that. Again, hold it with the tongs, light it up. That stuff works well. It's more expensive, but it burns really nicely, and that's what you want to be using. And like as I mentioned with the stick incense, I use a small amount, like an inch of it. Doesn't produce very much smoke. Smells nice, but it's, again, not producing a lot of smoke. What I notice with people is this idea that somehow you got to use like absolute total clouds of smoke, like it's just completely, you can't even see the person, there's so much smoke. I couldn't take that. I have smoke sensitivities. And a lot of people, again, will say, oh, I have allergies or whatever, I can't use incense. Try using a little bit, just a small amount. And if you can't use that, people will be like, what about, the spray stuff, and I'm like, I'm not wild about that, the aromatic oils, because really what's going on with the incense is it's burning. It's like a sacrifice. And rather than sacrificing, something like an animal or something like that, which I would never do, it's just burning up the incense or the candle wick. And the suffumigation is so key that I think that's important. I suppose you could use the non incense stuff, but to me, if you can't use incense, I would just use more candles. That would be my suggestion as far as what to do with it. So I hope that's helpful. A lot of the stuff, this is just really practical advice that from things I've built up over the years. If you're going to be doing this every day, it needs to be easy to do. If it's this really complicated thing that takes a lot of effort, you're just not going to do it. And I think that, in terms of, is this necessary or not? No, it's not necessary to use specific incense for talismans. And I think people have just gotten into this thing of that they have to do this because that's what the book says. And my experience is it's just not true. Particularly what happens with people is that they can't exactly follow the book and they just give up. It's better to do, a smaller ritual or something using, like I said, different kind of incense or whatever. And you do want it to be appropriate. If you're doing Venus, you wouldn't use, a Saturn style, something that smelled terrible. It doesn't make sense. It needs to be reasonably fitting. But a lot of stuff, like I said, white candles is a neutral color. It goes for everything. Frankincense, to me, that seems like, again, a fairly neutral incense that you could use for everything. So this is my 2 cents. Again, if you have a different approach, that's great. But what I would say too is you don't have to follow my approach. So make sure you grant everybody else the same courtesy, and don't start dumping on people or freaking people out because they're not doing exactly what you would do. It's their preference. And it's really not something that's going to be disastrous as long as you're staying more or less within the spirit of what you're doing. And as long as, to me, with a devotional approach, you have a spirit of respect, you have, friendship and inspiration. It's really hard to go wrong with that kind of attitude. So I hope you find it interesting. Again, check out the links for the specific incense there. In terms of where do I find specific incense, I mean, I don't know. I mean, just go on. I would have to go online and look on Google. That's how I would look at stuff. And I had a supplier, and they basically, it was one guy, and he essentially went out of business. So I don't really have any suggestions as far as where you can get some specific kind of incense. I don't know. Um, but again, I hope you find that useful. And if you want to emulate what I do, great. If you want to find your own approach, that's really wonderful too.